Columbus, Ohio. Mount Carmel West stood on the city's west side like any other modern hospital complex. Glass corridors, steady hum of ventilators, the 24-hour rhythm of lives measured in heartbeats and beeping monitors. For nearly a decade, one of the most trusted physicians in its intensive care unit was Dr. William Husel, an anesthesiologist turned critical care specialist known for calm under pressure. Colleagues described him as confident, unhurried, the kind of doctor who could speak softly while making split-second decisions that meant the difference between pain and peace that he had joined Mount Carmel after years of training in internal medicine and anesthesiology at the Cleveland Clinic, one of the nation's top programs. In the ICU, he handled the hardest cases: multi-organ failure, trauma, end-stage disease. Families met him in the worst hours of their lives, and many remembered him as kind. He talked about dignity, about easing suffering. His reputation grew quietly inside the hospital's white corridors. Then, near the end of 2018, whispers began to move through the nursing staff. Some nurses noticed that Dr. Husel's standing orders for terminally ill patients included large doses of fentanyl, the synthetic opioid at the heart of America's overdose crisis. Fentanyl was standard in ICUs for pain relief, but the amounts written, sometimes 500 to 1,000 micrograms in a single push, were higher than what many clinicians considered typical. Nurses followed orders. That was their job. But unease grew when patients receiving those doses died within minutes. In October 2018, a pharmacist reviewing automated medication logs flagged the pattern. Within weeks, the hospital's pharmacy director escalated the concern to administrators. The doses were unusually high across several cases, all tied to the same physician. The pharmacy system's software generated what it called hard stops, alerts that required override authority. Dr. Husel had that authority. The computer recorded each override like a heartbeat in data. When administrators lined up those timestamps, the pattern was unmistakable. Mount Carmel's leadership confronted the question every hospital fears: when does end-of-life comfort care cross into criminal territory? On November 21, 2018, Dr. Husel was quietly removed from duty pending review. The internal inquiry identified dozens of cases, patients who had received high opioid doses during withdrawal of life support between 2015 and 2018. By December, the number reached at least 34. Every chart showed the same sequence: patient deemed near death, family informed of hopeless prognosis, order entered for fentanyl and midazolam to ensure comfort, death pronounced within minutes. The hospital self-reported to law enforcement. On December 10, 2018, Mount Carmel issued a public statement acknowledging that a doctor had been removed and that 27 patients had received potentially excessive medication doses. The name wasn't yet released, but within hours reporters identified Husel. The story hit national wires under the same headline: Hospital accuses doctor of overdosing patients. For a medical system built on trust, it was a nightmare. Families of the deceased learned the allegations from television. Some felt shock, others gratitude. They believed their loved ones had been spared suffering. The line between mercy and murder was no longer theoretical. It ran through the ICU. Columbus police opened a criminal investigation, seizing electronic health record data and interviewing nurses, pharmacists, and administrators. The Franklin County Prosecutor's Office convened a grand jury. Dr. Husel hired defense counsel and maintained silence, saying through lawyers that every dose had been medically justified for terminal patients and that none of the deaths were unexpected. Meanwhile, Mount Carmel suspended 20 staff members and fired several nurses and pharmacists who had participated in the medication orders. The hospital CEO issued an apology and announced new opioid prescription safeguards: 2 physician verification, dose limits, and mandatory ethics consultations. Behind the scenes, risk management teams prepared for a wave of lawsuits. The case struck a national nerve. America was already grappling with the opioid epidemic. Now a respected physician stood accused of using hospital opioids not to addict, but to end lives. Talk shows called him the fentanyl doctor, blending outrage with confusion. Medical ethicists reminded audiences that morphine and fentanyl at the end of life were standard tools of palliative care. The difference lay in intent. Was the purpose comfort, or was it to hasten death? That question, nearly impossible to prove medically, would become the heart of the criminal charges that in June 2019 after 6 months of investigation. A Franklin County grand jury indicted Dr. Husel on 25 counts of murder, one for each patient prosecutors said had died from excessive doses. The indictment made him one of the most charged physicians in U.S. history. He surrendered voluntarily, posted bond, and was released to await trial. Prosecutors alleged that fentanyl doses ranging from 500 to 2,000 micrograms were intentional acts to hasten death. The defense called that interpretation medically illiterate, noting that critical care tolerance varied and that all patients were already dying. Mount Carmel publicly confirmed it had reached settlements with several families and paid millions in damages. The Catholic-affiliated health system also placed its CEO and senior medical officers on leave. Regulators from the Ohio Board of Pharmacy and the State Medical Board launched their own disciplinary actions. Husel's medical license was suspended indefinitely. The Ohio Attorney General's office described the case as a tragedy wrapped in complexity. Inside court filings, the numbers told two competing stories. The prosecution's toxicology experts said the doses far exceeded what could ever be necessary for comfort and caused respiratory arrest. The defense's palliative care specialists testified that high opioid doses can be clinically appropriate when ventilators are withdrawn, and that death following withdrawal is medically inevitable regardless of medication strength. Between those interpretations lay the thinnest of moral margins by early 2020 as pretrial hearings filled local headlines. The hospital where it all began was undergoing rebranding. Mount Carmel West closed its inpatient units, citing strategic consolidation. Employees quietly referred to the change as an attempt to outlive scandal. For families, it felt like erasure. They wanted answers. The prosecutor promised them in court. Then the pandemic hit, delaying everything. The world outside the courthouse descended into its own crisis of ventilators and opioid sedations, making the Husel case feel both prophetic and surreal. When jury selection finally began in February 2022, nearly 4 years had passed since his suspension. The trial would last 10 weeks, but its opening question was as sharp as ever. When a doctor eases pain knowing death will follow, is that mercy or homicide? The courtroom sat under fluorescent light, windowless, a theater built for judgment. After 3 years of accusation, delay, and preparation, the case of Dr. William Husel finally came to trial in February 2022. 25 counts of murder had been reduced to 14. Prosecutors had narrowed their focus to the patients they believed best demonstrated intent. Each name represented a family, a chart, and a dose of fentanyl written in black ink on an electronic screen. The jury, 12 citizens from Franklin County, had been warned the evidence would be technical and emotional. They would listen to weeks of testimony about pain, respiration, and the thin line between mercy and harm. Forensic exhibits weren't weapons or fingerprints. They were dosage graphs, medication logs, and autopsy charts. Prosecutors told the jury this was not a story of compassion, but of a doctor who went too far. They described a pattern: high doses, quick deaths, a routine that ignored protocol. They pointed to fentanyl amounts up to 20 times higher than standard practice. Their theme was simple: no patient should die because of a doctor's dosage. The phrase repeated like a metronome throughout the state's presentation. The defense framed it differently. Every patient, they said, had been terminal. Life support was being withdrawn. Families had been prepared for the end. The doses, though large, were medically rational, to suppress gasping, to prevent pain as ventilators came out. The prosecutor's argument, they said, confused coincidence with causation, people near death dying when treatment stops. The first witnesses were pharmacists and nurses. They described their unease when they saw large orders enter the electronic system. 500 micrograms of fentanyl here, 1,000 micrograms there. Some said they trusted the doctor's authority. Others admitted fear of questioning him. Their voices were careful, professional, the kind that carry both respect and regret. Cross-examination revealed that none had protested in real time. The defense asked whether any policy had defined a maximum dose. The answer was no. Hospital executives testified next. They detailed the discovery process in 2018, the pharmacy audit, the decision to remove Husel from duty, and the call to police. Under questioning, Administrators conceded that Mount Carmel had no written upper limit for opioid comfort care until after the scandal broke. Policy gaps became part of the defense narrative, system failure, not criminal intent. Then came the experts. Palliative care physicians from across the country filled the witness stand with calm technical language. They explained opioid titration, tolerance, and the doctrine of double effect. The principle that medication given to relieve suffering is ethical even if it may unintentionally shorten life, as long as the goal is comfort, not death. Prosecutors challenged that idea, arguing that the sheer magnitude of Husel's doses showed purpose. Defense experts countered that comfort care often required large doses when patients were tolerant from long ICU stays. The courtroom became a duel of charts and physiology. Family members testified through tears, describing final moments that had seemed peaceful. Some even thanked staff at the time. When they learned years later that a criminal case had been filed, emotions flipped to confusion and betrayal. The duality hung in the air, gratitude then outrage, peace then doubt. Through it all, Husel sat still behind the defense table, expression neutral, occasionally taking notes. He did not testify. His lawyers wanted the focus on evidence, not emotion. After 7 weeks, the state rested. Their final slide showed 2 columns: expected palliative dose versus actual dose. The numbers on the right dwarfed the left. They told jurors, these deaths were predictable, therefore preventable, therefore crimes. The defense's closing argument moved slowly, deliberately. They showed each patient's chart, describing organ failure, oxygen levels near zero, the moment life support was withdrawn. They told the jury, you cannot murder someone who is already dying. They reminded them that medicine is judgment, not arithmetic, and that the law requires proof of intent, not just correlation. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They requested transcripts, dosage tables, and a whiteboard to map their reasoning. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, broadcasting every movement. On April 20th, 2022, the 4-person stood and read the verdicts. Not guilty on all 14 counts. Silence. Then the collective exhale of a courtroom that had been holding its breath for 3 years. For prosecutors, the acquittal was devastating. For the defense, it was vindication. For the families, it was another wound. Some cried quietly, others left without speaking. The judge thanked the jury for enduring one of the most complex medical cases in state history. The trial had lasted 10 weeks, involved 53 witnesses, 110 exhibits, and 2 competing definitions of mercy. Outside, Dr. Husel spoke briefly for the first time. His voice was measured. The past 4 years have been very difficult. I'm grateful for the verdict. He did not elaborate. Reporters shouted questions about returning to medicine. He did not answer. The Ohio Medical Board kept his license suspended pending separate review. Mount Carmel issued a statement acknowledging the verdict and promising continued reform. The hospital had already paid over $60 million in civil settlements to families, admitting failures of oversight, but never conceding that murder had occurred. New policies limited fentanyl doses, required dual signatures, and logged every override in real time. Public opinion split. Some saw Husel as a scapegoat for institutional error, punished for doing what families quietly ask of doctors every day: relieve suffering, whatever the cost. Others saw him as a warning about the unchecked power of physicians in intensive care, where patients can't speak for themselves. The internet called it America's most complicated murder trial that wasn't. In academic journals, ethicists dissected the case. They debated the difference between intention and outcome, mercy and acceleration, trust and accountability. A review in the Journal of Critical Care Medicine concluded that the case illustrates the peril of criminalizing clinical judgment while highlighting the need for transparent end-of-life policies. Another editorial asked whether the fear of prosecution would now make doctors undertreat. Pain.by summer 2022, the courthouse emptied. But the ripples kept moving. Prosecutors defended their decision, saying they owed families an explanation in court even if they lost. Defense lawyers toured medical conferences, warning that documentation, not motives, protects clinicians. Within Ohio hospitals, new mandatory trainings reminded staff to chart everything: conversations, consent, dosages, rationale. Paperwork had become armored. Dr. Husel retreated from public life. He avoided interviews, living quietly while appeals over civil suits continued. The legal record remained fixed, charged with 25 counts, tried on 14, acquitted on all. Yet the question that had electrified the country still lingered in ethics classrooms and newsrooms alike. Where's the line between easing death and causing it? For the families, the verdict settled nothing. Some accepted it as closure. Others called it failure. The faces of their loved ones, people once identified only by medical chart numbers, stayed on advocacy websites that call for national standards in palliative dosing. Their stories continued as cautionary tales for every hospital administrator reading nightly audit reports. By the end of 2022, the phrase Mount Carmel case had become shorthand for a new kind of modern dilemma. When technology can keep bodies alive indefinitely, who decides when enough is enough? The courtroom had offered one legal answer, but medicine still wrestled with the moral one that the trial left behind no villains or heroes, only contradictions. A doctor trained to save lives stood accused of ending them. A hospital built on faith confronted its own uncertainty, and a city learned how fragile trust can be when medicine and law collide. The jury's verdict closed the criminal file, but the echo of those 14 names still moves through Ohio's ICUs like a quiet warning. Compassion can look like mercy or like too much power, depending on who writes the chart. After the verdict, Columbus awoke to a divided calm. The courthouse steps were empty by morning, but the debate inside hospitals had only begun. Administrators across the United States read the Husel transcripts and realized that the question was larger than one doctor. How much medication was too much? Who decided intent? And what did comfort care really mean when families were watching monitors flatline? Mount Carmel's executives spent the rest of 2022 rebuilding trust. They created a new palliative care council, rewrote opioid use protocols, and required two-physician approval for any large fentanyl dose. Electronic systems were reprogrammed to alert pharmacists instantly when an order exceeded preset thresholds. Nurses received legal briefings on documentation, because in the post-Husel world, every signature could become evidence. Professional organizations turned the case into a textbook. The American Journal of Health System Pharmacy published an analysis titled Lessons from the Mount Carmel Investigation. Medical law conferences used it to illustrate how criminal courts interpret clinical judgment. The case became a permanent module in hospital compliance training, a warning that transparency protects everyone. For doctors, the fear was chilling. If intent can be misread, do we stop giving enough medicine? One ICU physician told reporters. Ethics professors called it the chilling effect paradox, the risk that compassion could wither under threat of prosecution. Within months, palliative care specialists nationwide were drafting clearer consent forms that spelled out, in writing, that families understood comfort medications might shorten life. In Ohio, prosecutors defended their choices publicly. They said the evidence had demanded a trial, that 14 unexplained deaths could not go unexamined. They admitted the burden of proof had been higher than any medical statistic could reach. Jurors later told local papers they believed Husel's intent was comfort, not harm, but they also believed oversight had failed him and the hospital alike. Civil suits continued. By 2023, Mount Carmel's insurer had paid more than $60 million in settlements. None named Husel personally responsible. All cited systemic breakdowns, pharmacy alerts ignored, communication gaps, missing policy. The Catholic health system released a statement. We have learned painful lessons about vigilance and accountability. In medical schools, the story became a quiet cautionary tale told to residents finishing night shifts. Chart everything. Discuss every decision. Never assume shared understanding. In law schools, it became a study in the difficulty of proving intent beyond reasonable doubt. Both disciplines claimed the case as their OWN.B. By 2024, the phrase the Husel effect had entered policy language. It described a new equilibrium between aggressive pain relief and legal self-protection. Hospitals introduced dual witness protocols for terminal extubations. 2 clinicians, 1 charting doses, 1 documenting consent. Families noticed the change. More forms, more explanations, less quiet intuition. Medicine had become more careful, maybe more bureaucratic. but also safer. For the public, the story slowly faded from headlines into podcasts and documentaries that treated it as the moment modern medicine confronted its moral limits. The final image most viewers remembered was the judge thanking the jury for its endurance, a signal that the state had done its duty. Even if the outcome divided opinion, Dr. William Husel remains free. His license suspension is still under administrative review. He has not returned to clinical practice. The hospital has rebuilt under new leadership. The families live with verdicts that solved nothing about grief but closed a chapter of suspicion. The case stands now as a mirror for every future debate about medical intent. Whether a doctor's duty ends at prolonging life or at preserving dignity. It proved that in modern hospitals, where machines can keep hearts beating indefinitely, the hardest decisions are not about how to save life, but how to end suffering without crossing the line that law still calls murder. By the time the headlines faded, the story of Dr. William Husel had already reshaped how hospitals, prosecutors, and families think about death inside an ICU. It began as a local scandal and ended as a national mirror, forcing medicine and law to stare at one another across a table neither fully understood. On one side stood the duty to relieve pain. On the other, the fear of crossing into intent. In the years after the verdict, critical care units across the country kept whispering his name. Residents compared dosing charts. Ethics committees rehearsed worst-case scenarios. And every discussion circled the same realization. A syringe could hold compassion or controversy, depending on who later read the chart. Administrators spoke about the Husel effect in the same tone airline pilots use for checklists: procedural, necessary, designed to prevent chaos. Columbus moved on quietly. Mount Carmel West's old ICU was remodeled, its walls repainted, its signage replaced. The place where the questions had started now looked like any other ward. But inside the hospital network, protocols written in 2022 remain active. Dual signatures for large opioid orders. Mandatory pharmacist review. Automatic alerts sent to ethics officers after a set threshold. The safeguards are invisible to patients but constant for staff. A digital conscience humming behind every monitor. For families who lost loved ones, closure still comes unevenly. Some found comfort in the reforms, believing that oversight would keep others safe. Others say justice remains unfinished, that acquittal does not erase suspicion. Each anniversary reopens the conversation, a reminder that the law's verdict and the heart's verdict rarely match. Beyond Ohio, the case shifted medical education itself. New curricula now teach end-of-life medicine alongside legal literacy. Young doctors learn not only how to titrate fentanyl, but how to document intent, how to prove that mercy was mercy, not malice. Ethics professors call this the new paper trail of compassion. When historians of medicine look back at the early 21st century, the opioid epidemic and the Husel trial will appear side by side, one about addiction, the other about the opposite extreme, fear of pain control. The lesson of both is proportion, vigilance, and humility before the complexity of human suffering. The case ended without a definitive villain or hero. It left only the reminder that trust is fragile, that every medical decision lives in the space between relief and responsibility. The courtroom lights dimmed, the jurors went home, but the question remains suspended in hospitals everywhere. How much comfort is too much, and who decides when enough has been done?